This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Robert, Kathryn, and I are excited to have Dain Edward here joining us at the roundtable. Dain has a BA in classical music, was a filmmaker for 15 years, and has an MFA in fiction from Hamline University. He's been teaching with the Minnesota Prison Writing Workshop since 2012, specializing in classes that dig deep into the structure and psychology of all forms of narrative. Welcome, Dain. We are so glad to have you.
Hi.
Welcome.
Yay. And of course, Hamline is also where I got my MFA, and I also work with the Prison Writing Workshop. So we've got a fellow Minnesotan, a Hamlinite, an MPWW teacher here, which is extra exciting for me. Get to geek out. Today we thought we would talk about the intersections between screenwriting or playwriting and narrative prose, novel writing. So Dain, why don't you start us out by telling us a little bit about your history in filmmaking?
Well, so, as you said in the introduction, I started out studying music. And even back then I really liked story and I was writing some. And the music thing just didn't feel quite right after college. And so I started experimenting with writing. And I found myself just writing. I was thinking about writing in a very structural way, and I watched a lot of films as well. And so it just sort of very naturally, I started to write stories that I wanted to see as films. And so, and then also because I was thinking about getting into writing more, but I also wanted a collaborative career. Like I wanted to be working with people directly. So I decided to try filmmaking. And so I went into it and I really liked it a lot. There's a lot of technical stuff to do and it's full of interesting people and you can travel and do lots of things. It can be a great career if you're actually making things that you like.
Right.
If you're making really crappy things that you don't like, then actually really punishing and not fun at all.
Yeah. So were you in the screenwriting role or in more of a production or director role? What was your role in filmmaking?
Well, I kind of did a lot of different stuff, but most of it professionally, I was a producer. So I was dealing with budgets and organization, and then, which is very kind of interesting by taking, what you do is you take a screenplay, which is sort of a blueprint. And then sorry, hang on just a second. So you take the screenplay as sort of a blueprint, and then the producer, one of their jobs is to break it down into pieces that are sort of like, resources, little pieces of resource that are sort of broken down into a story that'll then get reassembled later on as it's made.
Right.
But I did a lot of writing too. I studied it a lot and then worked with a lot of people on their scripts. And I wrote a lot of scripts of my own too and tried to market them and sell them. And, kind of like a lot of people do. Send them out to contests, those kinds of things. But eventually the resources, one of the interesting aspects of, writing for the screen is that it's not anything that you want. You have to be guided by the scope of the story in terms of what it would take to actually make it, which is a really interesting sort of challenge, like something that's can kind of guide the process and give you challenges that you have to overcome creatively. But it also becomes a problem when what you want to write is not something that anybody will ever make, or that you can't make yourself or can't make with your friends or anything like that. If you want a spaceship, it's a lot of money for a spaceship.
Sure.
But if you're writing fiction, like a prose, you can have as many spaceships as you want because they're free.
Yeah, definitely. That is one of the interesting differences between script writing and novel writing is that, words, they only cost us our time and energy, our talent to get them on the page. But if you're writing for film, then it becomes a much more collaborative effort, and there are all of those budgetary factors to consider. Do you find novel writing or fiction writing freeing compared to script writing?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the films that I was writing, the stories I was writing, when I would share them, people were weirded out by it. It was very challenging for them because of what I wanted to do. And as fiction, it makes a lot more sense. It works better to write it as fiction, some of it anyway. But also, I mean, it's hard to write something that almost nobody will ever read. I mean, even if you write a great screenplay, there's probably 100 people who will actually end up reading it and be involved in it. And then that's the end. Everybody else is going to watch the movie. This is for original screenplays. So I found that if I'm going to write something and it's never going to get made anyway, at least as a book, I can share that and publish that and think of it that way. But I still write everything almost as if it's a screenplay. Like it's the same writing process for me.
Okay.
So the stories that I write are generally novellas, and they kind of have the same sort of scope and sort of structure as screenplays often have.
So can we talk about that scope and structure and how screenwriting and story writing intersect there?
Yeah, so one of the things that's great about screenwriting, and I would kind of almost recommend almost anybody who, as a fiction writer, especially, what's great is it's very structural, and it can, if you want to, you can approach it in a very technical way, and you can really see breakdowns. I had a teacher who gave us literally page by page all the technical requirements of what a screenplay needs to be, which can be suffocating creatively in some ways. But what was interesting about it was it can make suggestions. So like if you're trying to figure out your story, if you think of it as a screenplay, well, you're getting to the end of the first act, which is going to need, these types of things for it to be a successful screenplay. So is that make suggestions to you as a fiction writer about how you want to approach it? So that's one part of it. Also, yeah.
So is that a part that you use when you sit down to write your novellas? That it sounds like genre expectations or form expectations. For a script, you must have this in Act 1 and this in Act 2 and this midpoint and this. So is that something you find helpful or creatively hindering? And is it something you enjoy using when you write prose?
It's something that it's definitely used when I read and respond to people's work. It's such an ingrained part of my writing process in terms of, as I conceive of a story and start to sort of think about what it might be, I automatically start putting in sort of guideposts into it to sort of guide like, well, how might it end? So then I get some ideas about that. And then, well, how would I make it complicated? And, some of these suggestions structurally, it can be a little dangerous because it can really turn your story into sort of like a, clockwork machine.
Yes. Kind of formulaic.
Yeah. And that's definitely challenging. But part of it is, I think I use it a lot as an educator too. Like and this is part of what's interesting to me, kind of what I wanted to talk about was I was interested in everybody's writing process about how much time you spend preparing. Like more specifically, like I found that in screenwriting and in filmmaking, we would do a lot of prep beforehand about the story.
Right.
We'd do character research, break them down, because we kind of knew what some of the needs of the story would be about what type of things had to happen and where they had to happen as these sort of, signposts in there. But when I was getting my MFA, the literary writers that I was talking to, and genre writers do a lot of that preparation too. A lot of the literary people seem to just they would just sit down and just write. And their first draft would just be, they would just go on and on and on and on and on. And then from that first draft, they would try to break down and see what kind of story might be in there. And then that would be their, the material that they would use. But it took a long time. Whereas I'm like figuring out a lot of that stuff up front before I even really start to
Yeah.
draft anything. So how do you guys do that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I do so much journaling, and I know Kathryn does too. And Robert, I think you do a lot of plotting as well. We definitely believe in pre-writing and development work so that we know what we're doing when we start that first draft. And I have written the first draft as the exploratory draft, many, many years ago, just because I didn't know better. You have a story idea, you sit down and write. And one of my novels started as a short story, and then it became a play, and then it became a novel. And I wrote hundreds of pages just trying to figure out what the story was, and this was over a number of years. So experience taught me that can be a huge waste of time. So I'm definitely a believer in pre-writing, but not having been trained as you were in screenwriting, I don't have kind of the structural formula of expectations. I do I do have sort of the structure of story always in mind at some point, but not when I'm journaling, not at the pre-writing stage. Mm-hmm. I think as I'm putting together the storyboard, I'm looking for those elements, but I try to avoid feeling framed in by those structural constraints. Mm-hmm. Kathryn and Robert, how about you guys?
I think I wish I knew more about it when I started writing. I feel like when you start writing and you say, "Oh, I'm a writer, like this is what I do," you think of the writing, the drafting, the multiple drafts of your story. You don't think about pre-writing or pre-production or like, hey, I need to have all of this stuff before I start. And so it is so much discovery, even if you're a quote unquote plotter, right? Where you kind of know where you're going. And I really wish I had learned earlier how to be a better pre-writer, because it does save you so much time in trying to figure out what you're trying to say to begin with. So
right. Agreed.
Yeah. I think we are used to having commonly consumed stories. And so there is a certain unconscious expectation on what is a beginning, what is a middle, and what is an end outside of, general experimental work. And if you think about that, even from a point of view of what we say to each other during the day, the reason we've formulated communication in words is as a form of shorthand. And so you don't necessarily sort of walk out into your house and start spouting off about nothing in particular. You'll introduce what you're talking about to the other person with an end in mind, oh, hey, are we going to the shops today? It's a very banal commentary, but it has a beginning and an end. It has a suggestion of an inciting incident. Are we going to the shops? There's some action that's going to take place, and presumably there's an outcome from that. We don't just sort of walk out and say, the sky is blue. I was thinking about wearing some black jeans.
Stream of consciousness.
Yeah. And your point is, so I think, and spending years in teaching people presentation skills, one of the things that you get very good at is coaching people to be succinct and come to a point, and avoid the ramble. And I think as a novelist, it's very easy to, especially when you're first beginning, you get a flash of a scene. And that's often what drives people. It might be the end, it might be the beginning, it might be something, oh, that'd be so cool. And then as Dain points out, that's not always going to get made visually because it might be impossible. Oh, they're going to fall through this interstellar time warp thing. Yeah, expensive. And so you get that flash of a scene, but that's not a story. And so I think, one of our tricky points is to do the prep work in our minds even. And whether somebody is what they call a plotter or a pantser, you really want to have some idea in your mind of what the story actually is to make drafting easier. But the advantage I think with a novelist is that it's not expensive to keep coming other than time. It's not expensive to keep coming back and reproducing and reforming it. Whereas I guess if you get it wrong with script writing, there's a lot of people that can come back to you and say, "Oh, I didn't like this," or this scene doesn't work, or this is going to be too expensive, or you didn't follow our guidelines, or it's 10 pages too long, or So it'd be interesting to hear Dain talk about that in terms of the collaborative process as well at some point.
Yeah, Dain, why don't you talk a little bit about the difference between writing fiction? We all know you sit in a room with your computer or your notebook, and the script writing or movie production process, and how that's so different creatively.
So with screenwriting, a lot of screenplays do start out the same way as fiction. I mean, somebody just sits alone, or maybe two people or something. They just sit and they got some ideas and they just go. And they just write whatever they want. They just put everything they can think of, whatever gives them joy. It can be very, very freeing, very exciting. And the other part too that's nice is, generally speaking, it doesn't take quite as long to write well, I mean, sometimes the whole process from when a script is written to when you actually shoot it can take a long time. But in terms of you don't have to flesh out quite as much detail. You can really get into the story and just get it moving and get the characters going, and it can be very exciting that way. So it can be a shorter process in that way. And then collaboratively, the screenwriter, a professional screenwriter, in a sense, is somebody who they're a servant to the process a little more than a fiction writer would be. And so everybody, from the director to the actor to the composer, always has in mind that the film will be more than whatever their part is.
Right.
So when that's working and all the people and elements are actually really strong, that can be really exciting because it can actually sort of feed. The screenwriter writes something, which then inspires the director, which inspires the actors. And then what can also be cool is you write your screenplay, and then there's maybe a few other people, hopefully only just a few, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 or whatever, smart people who know a lot about story, who aren't the writer, who will come back to you and say, this isn't working, but this is. Right. And let's, can we add more of this or push more on this part or, change this dialogue? So you can end up with this process that can be magical where you just keep going through the process over and over again. It's like drafting any kind of fiction in that sense, but with screenwriting, it can be a lot of those. And if it's done right, at the end, it's something that, I would never have written.
Right. I
never could have written. But my name's still on there because I did it and then gathered all these other pieces and brought it all together. That's really rare. Usually it sucks. Usually it's really frustrating because everybody's meddling and everybody's poking and prodding and turning. And, there's a lot of movies that you've seen where, you went, whatever. That was probably a very good screenplay, but just got fiddled with to death.
Sure. So as the screenwriter, you do not get kind of top dog status. You don't get to veto other people's input if it's trashing the script.
Yeah. Sometimes being a pro, part of the job is to take somebody's bad suggestion and then somehow use that to turn it into something actually good. Or, or and sometimes you have to respect that, somebody who isn't maybe a writer does know something. They are actually offering you something. You just got to figure out sort of what they need.
How to translate. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. And so it's a very it's almost more like, I knew somebody who did technical, they were a medical writer. So they were sort of a quasi journalist where they would be writing a lot of stuff that doctors would read.
Right.
And so they had to figure out how to make all this technical stuff into something that was sort of, shaped like narrative and journalism and those things for people to read. So it can be a little bit more like that. Sometimes too much, and it all just becomes, numbers and gears, and it can be very soul deadening as well.
Yeah.
Right. Do you think that made you a better writer quicker, though, because of the feedback and the constant, like, having other people tell you what they think and having to incorporate that?
Well, I think, man, I mean, I can't imagine trying to be a writer without all that experience, because it definitely taught me how to sort of take feedback, how to, workshop with people so that I can sort of, protect what I need to protect, give up what I want to give up. So there's a lot of that. Also, and this gets maybe a little back to sort of before the collaborative process exactly, but screenwriting has all these requirements, not just, about that people talk about that's sort of formulaic, but as just a fiction writer of any kind, it offers all of these questions that can be asked. And so I try not to think about it like requirements, like it must be this and must be that.
Right. Yeah.
But what it does do is anytime that I'm starting to conceive of a story, my screenwriting experience gives me a constant sort of stream of questions to ask that can draw the story out of me in a way that's fairly functional, as opposed to, I think a lot of times people write and they just draft. They just start going.
Yeah.
And they write and write, and they write 1,000 pages to just to find the story, because they're running on this instinct that they have from having read a pile of novels since they were little and watching all these movies. So they intuitively know a lot about story, but they don't know how to really lock it down and ask these simple questions.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I think having a grasp of story structure is so useful to us as writers, and for shaping those ideas and inspirations into something productive, but still creative, still not formulaic.
I like how you said that it made the story functional, and that, when the story is working, that's magic right there. So pretty cool.
It's amazing how much of that can be. I think we kind of get shamanistic about a lot of literature where we talk about it like it's all this magical things that happen. And especially when we're writing and it's inspiring and it's exciting, but also like what happens after you've done your draft and now you've got to actually start editing. Now you got to read your story and you've got to figure out what to change, whether to change it. Think like an editor, or if you're working with somebody else's work as an editor, how do you know what to even say and how to approach it? And some of it's intuitive because, we have this experience, but screenwriting can actually ask very specific questions, like, does this feel like it's finished? Does it, and you can say no, of course, like you don't necessarily want some of these things in there depending on what the story is, but it's nice to know very clearly that I'm making some conscious choices and can challenge the story. Like, does it need this? Does it need that?
I love that. I love the idea that because I think a lot of writers get frightened or concerned about restrictions and so-called structure, and the creative part of our minds fights it and says, no, I don't want to be constrained by this. When in reality, we have to, for it to even be a story, it has to have a beginning and a middle and an end. But I like what you're saying, that rather than trying to shove everything in, what you do is you turn it back on itself and ask questions. And I think that's fantastic, because then you can look at almost any views on story structure, and there are many out there, and just pick the questions that you like, so and like as the example you just said, does this feel finished, or does this scene progress the story, does this character make some decision that fits with their model of the world? Those are the sort of really helpful things to understand that you don't necessarily need to think about when you're drafting. Although, as you say, they're helpful to have that background sort of unconscious ability. For any writer, I think it just streamlines the process. And it sounds to me like that starting out in screenwriting has really nailed that down for you, so that those questions almost become automatic. But I think they're questions that any good editor would ask anyway, which is, are we getting rising stakes? Is the conflict here? And, all those sort of general things that you learn through having made major mistakes time and time again.
Yeah, and it depends a little bit on what type of writing you're trying to do too.
Right.
some stuff really doesn't, the writer and who they're writing for and all those things. I mean, they don't have to care about any of this. So that depends too, being conscious about that. Not every story has to have a first and second and a third act. You don't have to do that, but it's nice to understand what that is so that you can ask that question of yourself.
Yes.
Do I want that in this story? Does the story need something like that? How would I do that? It's nice to have that available to me.
It is nice to have that available, and I think it's critical that writers understand what those things are so that when you make that choice, do I need it or not, it comes from an informed place. By not having those things, am I making the best decision for the story to make it an effective, engaging, compelling story, or am I just experimenting and nobody will ever read it because, because it's my playground and nothing more.
I find this comes up a lot when I'm working with people who want to self-publish. I think a lot of people, they have a lot of story in them that they want to get out. And they're in an understandable sort of excited hurry to sort of get the story down, and then they want to share it right away. Right. And they don't necessarily, if they haven't been, trained, gone to MFA school and all that stuff, don't necessarily have a lot of sense of what the rest of that editing process might be. Right. And so when I've read some of the work, then I'm like, oh, okay, you've got this great material. Now let's start breaking it down, and let's, we can do with that. And it's very, very handy to have that sort of sensibility if you aren't going to be taking your work and workshopping it with a whole bunch of people and working with professional editors and those things.
Exactly.
But it also sort of has really ingrained in me the power and necessity of working with other people, because I simply can't see the work myself.
Right.
And so I'm always trying to get people to do more work on the editing part of the process.
It's a strange form of art, isn't it? In that it's a very, it is a collaborative art, the art of word. You can't imagine that somebody would have come up and, after Michelangelo and retouched his work, or somebody, coming along to a famous sculptor and saying, well, I don't like the way you did that arm. Let's chop that off and redo it. It just doesn't happen. But somehow with the written word, it's one of those things that becomes more collaborative and can be challenging if you've got a strong opinion about your own work.
True, although I'm sure the masters were apprentices at some point in their youth, and then their master was saying, "Oh, that arm is horrible."
Well, this is the thing, isn't it? That's what happens when you listen to people, if they read Stephen King's On Writing and they follow that religiously, and they go, "Oh no, he just says you just got to get the rock and then let the rock shape itself into something that's a magical piece of work." And he can say that because he's been writing stories since he was 4. And was published when he was I don't know when Carrie was published. Right. Not that it wasn't an easy journey. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying he has such an intuitive understanding of story. It's easy to say, we just write it.
His craft book also came out after he'd been publishing for how many decades. So he had all that, he had his 100,000 hours of writing behind him.
Exactly.
So Dain, do you have any final thoughts for us about the intersection between screenwriting and fiction writing as we wrap this episode up?
No. I think everybody should look into it. I think everybody should spend time there learning about it, partly because there's sort of an untapped reservoir of almost every writer has because of all the films that they've been watching since they were a kid. Once you understand more about how that's constructed, what it's made of, you can actually put some of that sort of absorbed technical skill that we all have to work as a writer. If you know more about what that's really made of and how that's done.
Right.
And then also, and something we didn't even talk about in this whole process is so many movies have been adapted from literature.
Right.
So that's a process that any writer could encounter at some point. When somebody says, well, now what about an adaptation of your work? If you understand how screenwriting works already, then you already have a way to maybe access that and start thinking about that.
Yes. Yeah. I definitely think people should go read scripts, play scripts, or movie scripts, whatever you can get your hands on. And if nothing else, study how stories are moved with so little on the page, without the narrative, without the scene building, without the mood building, just with dialogue and the bare bones in terms of those other elements we put into our prose. So thank you so much, Dain. This has been a pleasure, and we are going to have you back. So everyone look for another episode with Dain Edward. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.